So, in case you haven't heard, recently Twitch started suspending streamers, most notably Hassan Piker, for using the words cracker and honky. According to Twitch, the word cracker, a mild insult usually used against white people, is hateful conduct because it promotes or encourages discrimination, denigration, harassment, or violence based on race. Now, I'm going to tell you why this is all complete BS. First, let's take a look at the history of the word cracker. A lot of ding-dongs out there say that the word cracker originated as a word to refer to white masters who would crack their whips at enslaved black people. This just isn't true. The word originated around the late 1700s and was used by white people in those days to refer to white convicts that were transported from Great Britain to Virginia originally. In 1790, Benjamin Franklin wrote of a race of runagates and crackers equally wild and savage as the Indians. His words, not mine. The word, according to the Earl of Dartmouth, originated from their great boasting, though other sources say it did refer to cracking whips to drive cattle and other livestock, but not, according to any source I could find, to refer to anyone cracking whips against enslaved human beings. Don't get me wrong, white people definitely whipped enslaved black people in the 19th century, but that's just not the origin of the term cracker, according to any primary source that I could get my hands on. Anyway, I can say with some confidence that the word cracker began as a white-on-white insult to refer to poor and rowdy white people, basically equivalent to the word redneck, and that black folks probably didn't start using it against white folks until around the middle of the 20th century. The word cracker has been used proudly by white people to refer to themselves, especially in the Southeast United States where I'm from, but today it is mostly associated by most folks in most places with black folks and people of color denigrating white people, unlike its origins being used by white people to refer to other white people. So now let's figure out if using the word cracker really violates Twitch's terms of service. Does it encourage discrimination based on race? In order to answer that question, we first have to define the word race, which is not as easy as you might think, because most people think they know what race is when they really have no idea, especially in contemporary society. The word race was used to refer to different nations and ethnicities of people until the middle of the 19th century, when incredibly debunked pseudoscience began trying to categorize people scientifically into distinct biological categories to justify atrocities like the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of black human beings. Today, the word race has no scientific meaning whatsoever. It's simply a socially constructed phenomenon which is used to divide people into a hierarchical caste system. We call that caste system race. The easiest way to prove that this is true is to examine the concept of whiteness. Just think about it. What the heck does it mean to be white? White is not a skin color. I am white, but my skin is not white. It's kind of a pinkish beige. It doesn't even refer to lightness of skin. There are plenty of Asian people, for instance, who have much lighter skin than me, but nobody would consider them to be white. Some people think white refers to people who are indigenous to Europe, so let's explore that a little. It was only about 8,500 years ago that pale skin like mine first started developing in human beings in Europe. Before that, they had dark skin. In what we now call the UK, light skin only developed about 6,000 years ago, and it probably came from the Middle East, which is somewhat ironic for reasons we'll get into in just a bit. And this trait didn't only develop in Europe. There are people indigenous to modern-day Iran, China, and Siberia who have physical traits we associate with whiteness, but they aren't considered to be white. Whiteness isn't a culture. The ancient Greeks had no concept of whiteness, even though today most people think of ancient Greece as a cradle of white Western culture. The cultures of France and Switzerland are quite distinct. They have much different food, different languages. Are Russian and Eastern European people white, or are they Slavic? What about Ashkenazi Jewish people? Do they have white culture? The more you dig beneath the surface, the more you see how messy this idea of white culture becomes. Hey, here's an idea. Try telling an Irish person that they have the same culture as the British and see how they react. Speaking of the Irish, did you know that just over a century ago, Irish people weren't considered white at all? Irish American historian Art MacDonald writes, Irish and African Americans had lots in common and lots of contact during the mid-19th century. They lived side by side and shared workspaces. In the early years of immigration, the poor Irish and blacks were thrown together, very much part of the same class, competing for the same jobs. In the census of 1850, the term mulatto appears for the first time, due primarily to intermarriage between Irish and African Americans. Free blacks and Irish were viewed by the white Americans as related, somehow similar, performing the same tasks in society. It was felt that if amalgamation between the races was to happen, it would happen between Irish and blacks. But ultimately, the Irish made the decision to embrace whiteness, thus becoming part of the system which dominated and oppressed blacks. Although it contradicted their experience back home, it meant freedom here since blackness meant slavery. An article by a black writer in an 1860 edition of the abolitionist newspaper The Liberator explained how the Irish ultimately attained their objectives. 15 or 20 years ago, a Catholic priest in Philadelphia said to the Irish people in that city, "You are all poor and chiefly laborers. The blacks are poor laborers. Many of the native whites are laborers. Now, if you wish to succeed, you must do everything that they do, no matter how degrading, and do it for less than they can afford to do it for." The Irish adopted this plan. They lived on less than the Americans could live upon and worked for less. And the result is that nearly all the menial employments are monopolized by the Irish, who now get as good prices as anybody. There were other avenues open to American white men, and though they have suffered much, the chief support of the Irish has come from places from which we have been crowded. Once the Irish secured themselves in those jobs, they made sure blacks were kept out. They realized that as long as they continued to work alongside blacks, they would be considered no different. Later, as Irish became prominent in the labor movement, African Americans were excluded from participation. In fact, one of the primary themes of how the Irish became white is the way in which left labor historians, such as the highly acclaimed Herbert Gutman, have not paid sufficient attention to the problem of race in the development of the labor movement. And so we have the tragic story of how one oppressed race, Irish Catholics, learned how to collaborate in the oppression of another race, Africans in America, in order to secure their place in the white republic. Becoming white meant losing their greenness, i.e., their Irish cultural heritage and the legacy of oppression and discrimination back home. Imagine if the Irish had remained green after their arrival and formed an alliance with their fellow oppressed co-workers, the free blacks of the North. Imagine if they had chosen to include their black brothers and sisters in the union movement to wage a class battle against the dominant white culture, which ruthlessly pitted them against one another. Now, today, I don't think anyone would doubt that Irish people are considered white. So the fact that whiteness changes over time, the fact that who does and doesn't get included as white changes over time, just proves even further that race is a social construct which refers to a caste system of hierarchy and privilege, not any kind of biological or material scientific categorization of human beings. And it also doesn't refer to ethnicities because it changes over time. That is to say, who gets included changes over time. Of course, ethnicities develop over time, but race doesn't exist in the same way as ethnicities. Ethnicities include people based on shared culture, shared language, shared food, cuisine, shared origins, shared experiences. Race just lumps people together and then excludes the rest in a really arbitrary, weird way that has a lot to do with social power structures. It's not just about shared experiences, cultural norms, activities, language. It's about power. Another interesting example to study is how Arab people had a brief brush with whiteness in the early to mid 20th century, which still has ramifications today. In Between Muslim and White, the legal construction of Arab American identity, Khalid A. Bedouin describes the legal origins of Arab American identity during the racially restrictive naturalization era of 1790 through 1952, when whiteness was a prerequisite for American citizenship. Judges during the naturalization era viewed Arab as synonymous with Muslim identity. Because Muslims were presumed to be non-white and Arabs were presumed to be Muslims, Arabs were presumed ineligible for citizenship. But this presumption could be rebutted. Arab Christians could and did invoke the fact of their Christianity to argue that they were white. These arguments sometimes secured citizenship for Christian petitioners, but did not always rebut the presumption that every immigrant from the Arab world was Muslim. These cases reveal not only how judges viewed religion as a proxy for race, but also the ways in which they conflated Arab identity with Muslim identity to do so. This conflation persists today in that many people continue to believe that Arab is synonymous with Muslim, a conflation that is especially salient following the September 11th terrorist attacks. Almost all of the current literature on Arab Americans centers on how the government's response to 9/11 made people who are perceived to be Arabs, Muslims, or Middle Eastern vulnerable to legalized forms of racial surveillance, subordination, and violence. The courts during the naturalization era rendered Arab Muslim immigrants presumptively non-white and inassimilable, while sometimes finding Arab Christians eligible for citizenship and white by law. The legal construction of Arab American identity in the earlier period helped shape contemporary understandings and misunderstandings of both Arab and Muslim American identity today. Now, a side effect of these naturalization proceedings and legal battles is that Arab people are today counted as white on the US Census, even though Arab people are very clearly excluded from whiteness in modern society. This leads to a lot of different social problems for Arab people, since basically they are invisible to the census. But that goes beyond the scope of this video. I'll put a link in the description that will talk more about that issue if you want to learn more. But this gets to the heart of what whiteness really is. It's a system of exclusion. To be white is to have an absence of race. In modern Western society, whiteness is the default, and the concept of all other races have been constructed to exclude those people from white society and to oppress them. In the USA, we refer to the race of Asians, but do Vietnamese people, for example, see themselves as having the same race as Koreans or Japanese folks?
We don't.
Remember, race evolved in the middle of the 19th century as a pseudoscience, which was an attempt to reinforce and justify systems of oppression. The idea of whiteness evolved alongside capitalism and colonialism just a few hundred years ago to justify those systems of oppression. Today, race itself is a form of systemic oppression, which places white people at the top and black people at the bottom, and everyone else somewhere in between. In other words, race and racism are the same thing. Whiteness and white supremacism are the same thing. These are all the same social construct. You can't be racist against white people because white people are not systemically oppressed by race or racism. Racism exists only to exclude non-white people, and especially black people, from the benefits of whiteness. I know this may be difficult to wrap your head around if you've never heard these ideas before. If you've only thought of whiteness as something like an ethnicity or a culture or a place of origin or something like that, this might be kind of baffling. It was for me when I first encountered these ideas, but the history is very clear. Whiteness was invented as a social construct to subjugate black people, indigenous people, and people of color. Race and whiteness, as we think of it today, did not exist just a few centuries ago. Who gets included in whiteness has fluctuated and changed over time. There has been prejudice and bigotry going back thousands of years that predates this concept of racism, but the system of race and the social construct of whiteness are new phenomena which only exist to benefit white people at the exclusion of everyone else in the world. If you're skeptical about this, I put tons of links to videos, articles, and books you can check out and learn more. I really hope you will investigate it more deeply because the evidence is strong and the historic record is indisputable. Whiteness and white supremacy and racism and race are all the same thing. They all developed alongside colonialism and capitalism, and capitalism, colonialism, imperialism, and racism, they all reinforce each other. And this means that if we ever do want to truly end racism or capitalism, we have to abolish and dismantle whiteness. As long as whiteness exists as a power structure, racism will continue to be around, since whiteness is an inherently oppressive concept which subjugates people who aren't white. This is why reverse racism is not and cannot ever be a thing. You can't be racist against white people because racism is a system of oppression, a systemic form of oppression, which only benefits white people. This doesn't mean that white people can't be oppressed in other ways. Of course, there are poor white people, disabled white people, trans white people, white women, and all sorts of other white people who face other forms of oppression. I myself am non-binary. I am disabled. I am neurodivergent. There's all kinds of ways in which I am systemically oppressed, but I cannot be systemically oppressed by race because I am considered white. What all white people have in common is that we all benefit from the structure of racism in some way, since racism only exists to benefit us white people through the social construct of whiteness. Can non-white people be prejudiced and bigoted against white people? Sure. Can non-white people be rude to white people? Of course. But non-white people can't be racist against white people because racism is a form of systemic oppression which was constructed and exists today to benefit white people. So this is what we mean when we say you can't be racist against white people. Being rude to someone simply isn't the same as systemically oppressing them. This is also why it's often said that all white people are racist. This doesn't mean that all white people are personally bigoted against non-white people. That idea of racism stems from the liberal concept of racism, which sees racism as a personal moral failing. No, what we mean when we say that you can't be racist against white people is that all white people benefit from whiteness and, by extension, racism, and we will continue to do so for as long as whiteness exists. The only way to stop racism is to abolish whiteness and eradicate the concept of whiteness from existence because, again, race, racism, whiteness, white supremacism, these are all the same thing. As long as whiteness exists, racism exists. And as long as racism exists, white people benefit from racism. Hence, all white people are racist. I know that sucks to hear if you're white, especially since we have all been indoctrinated into believing that racism is some kind of personal moral failing and that the way to fight racism is through individual moral decisions. But white supremacist society wants us to believe that racism is just a form of individual bigotry and that the only people who are racist are Nazis and KKK members who go around overtly displaying their bigotry against non-white people. But if you really dig just a little bit beneath the surface and begin to understand systemic racism, you'll quickly see that that's simply not the case. Bigotry and prejudice are not the same as racism. Racism is systemic oppression, which benefits white people by excluding non-whites. Okay, so let's take one last look at this word cracker. Does it violate Twitch's terms of service by promoting or encouraging discrimination, denigration, harassment, or violence based on race? Well, given that whiteness is very clearly the absence of race, the answer is no. The fact is, words like cracker and honky are completely harmless. I've been called a cracker to my face before and a honky. It can't hurt me. It's not harmful to me. It might hurt my fifis, but it's not going to cause any kind of systemic oppression for me. These words do not reinforce systems of oppression. You could say that they are rude. You could say that they hurt your feelings, but you can't say they're racist, since racism is a form of systemic oppression which only benefits white people. In this manner, slurs against Black people, Indigenous people, trans people, and other oppressed groups are completely different from insults like cracker and honky because they do reinforce systems of oppression which harm people every single day. For instance, the R slur is used to attack disabled people who suffer from genocide, discrimination, violence, institutional subjugation, financial hardship, and countless other forms of oppression every single day. By using that slur, you are actively reinforcing a system which subjugates and kills disabled people. You are indeed encouraging and promoting discrimination, denigration, harassment, and violence against a group of people who are systemically oppressed. Yet, Twitch notoriously does not care about people using the R slur. For years now, countless disabled people have been trying to get Twitch to do something about discrimination and harassment of disabled people, and Twitch including the use of the ableist R slur. According to an article by Kate Irwin in Input magazine, an example of Twitch's inconsistent policy enforcement is with World of Warcraft streamer Asmongold, who has nearly 2.5 million followers on Twitch alone. Asmongold has said the R word and ableist slur multiple times on his broadcasts before without consequence. He's also a vocal proponent of the word, a take which will probably not age well. Come on, no R word? Listen, I think there's nothing wrong with saying the word, and I think that the people that get mad about it are fucking stupid. I'm going to keep saying it until Twitch tells me I can't. If I can't say it, I won't say it, but until then, I'm going to keep saying it, Asmongold said, which actually echoes the points that I made in my PewDiePipeline video a while back, where if we tolerate bigotry and prejudice, then it will fester and grow. And yeah, go watch that video if you haven't seen it already and you want to learn more about that. There's a lot of scientific evidence that shows that the more you allow systemic forms of social prejudice to flourish, the more likely it is to lead to harm. Of course, in order for it to lead to harm, it would have to be targeting a group of people who are systemically oppressed, and that doesn't include white people. White people, cis people, heterosexual people are never going to be harmed by this kind of thing because we're at the top of the hierarchy. Anyway, Twitch has also done precious little about mass targeted harassment and cyberbullying of trans people, Jewish people, and Black people on the platform. And of course, Twitch isn't alone here. YouTube has been documented discriminating against the LGBTQ+ community, Black people, and people of color for a long time. Twitter has been suppressing indigenous voices, for example, for years. And Facebook has been banning Black people for using the term white people for about a decade now. It's quite clear whose agenda these corporate social media companies are serving. They are quite selective in how they enforce terms of service and who they favor when it comes to censorship and banning people over quote-unquote hate speech. Twitch has taken a stance for white supremacism by pretending that the word cracker hurts anyone in any serious and meaningful way, while looking the other way as streamers and their audiences hurl all sorts of racist and ableist slurs that are truly harmful without any consequences and harass Black people, disabled people, people of color, trans people, and so many other marginalized groups. And as these groups continue to get suppressed and pushed away by corporate platforms like Twitch, we should begin thinking about how and why we engage with these platforms. There are better alternatives out there, ranging from cooperatively owned sites like Means TV to federated platforms like Mastodon and PeerTube, places where we can actually have a say in how these platforms are run, where we can actually control what is and isn't acceptable in our online communities. We have the tools to build better and safer spaces for ourselves right now. Until we do, there really won't be much we can do in the face of these kinds of ridiculous and harmful decisions, and we will kind of have nobody to blame but ourselves for slowly being shoved out and silenced. One last note for my fellow crackers: please educate yourself about race. Become a race traitor. The number one priority of white people should be educating other white people about the nature of whiteness, race, and systemic oppression. Believe it or not, despite the fact that we sit at the top of the racial caste hierarchy, whiteness does hurt most white people. It keeps us divided and separated from our fellow workers, and it stands as a huge barrier to the working class rising up to overthrow capitalism and imperialism, which should come as no surprise since that's exactly why whiteness was invented to begin with. Another note is that having this kind of understanding of race, truly knowing that whiteness exists as a social construct, a caste system that exclusively excludes people and oppresses and harms people who are not white. Having this view that the only path forward to ending racism is abolishing whiteness and becoming a race traitor, this is much more difficult for neoliberalism and other ideological garbage positions to recuperate and transform into something that will serve the needs of capitalism. Capitalists want you to believe in things like white privilege. They want you to believe in things like white fragility, which are concepts that, you know, have credence, but they don't want you to know about or examine that underlying truth that whiteness itself only exists as a harmful and oppressive caste structure. They want you to understand some of the symptoms of whiteness, but they don't want you to understand the underlying truth of what whiteness really is. So the more we talk about it, the more we educate each other about it, the stronger we will become and the harder it will be for white supremacism, which is whiteness, to control our minds. If you like this video, I highly encourage you to check out the latest video by FD Signifier about the experience of being a black content creator on YouTube. It's long, but every minute of it is pure gold, and I promise you'll enjoy it. I'll also put a link in the description to a panel stream that I did a while back with my comrade BP and several other black creators and people of color, where we talk about whiteness in depth, and I promise you will learn a lot there. You should also check out BP's channel while you're at it. BP discusses these issues over at Overthrow Media pretty much every single week and is just an awesome comrade. So be sure to subscribe to BP as well. For now, I'm your favorite cracker, American Johnson. Eventually, YouTube will probably censor this video because I use the word cracker. It's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time until we all get banned from these platforms. My golly, I hope that we can come up with a solution before that happens and the left just completely becomes irrelevant online altogether. Let's do something about that. Thanks for watching.
Good cracker.